guys, team, I don't think I've done this with you guys yet, so you just have to trust me. This will be a little fun, but it'll also, or maybe it's not going to be fun, maybe it's going to be weird, but I learned this in grad school. I'm going to take a poll of the class, but to get a true poll, I need you to not feel weirded out or nervous about telling me what you think in front of your peers. So let's see how well we can follow directions. Okay? I'm going to take a poll of the class, but the only rule is that you can't see what everyone else says. So close your eyes. Close your eyes. Yes, you as well. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Who thinks it's in anatomical position? Put your hand in the air. Keep your eyes closed. Team anatomical position. Okay, hands down. Close your eyes. Who thinks that you're internally rotated? Hands in the air. Keep your eyes closed. Hands down. Who thinks it's externally rotated? Hands in the air. Okay, hands down. Eyes open. Good. I feel like we were playing heads up. 7-0. I don't know if y'all had that. Guys, this is great for me as a teacher because it allows me to kind of see where we are as a class, right? The correct answer was she is externally rotated at the hip. Okay? So that means she had to have external rotation when she went down. Now, I'm going to teach you. That's my job. Guys, my job is not to read from PowerPoints all day. My job is to try to teach you guys hard stuff so that you can use it in the real world. Now, where is her pelvis? Is her pelvis, is it like this? Is it like this? Or is it like this? A, B, or C? C. Good, good. So her hip position, the pelvis is never lost. Never lost. So if the pelvis is here, pelvis is here, and her shin is in this type of position. You see that there? Her shin isn't outside of the weight of the penguin in the pelvis. Her shin is inside the penguin. The penguin's like, I see. So how would she have to move to get there? She'd have to externally rotate to get into this position. Does that make sense? Or another way to look at it, if we could magically freeze her body, use the force, make her float, rotate her body back here, and I'd say, okay, how would you have to rotate your hip to go back home? She'd have to internally rotate to go back home. So she had to externally rotate. So she's going to have external rotation of the hip to go down, and then she's going to have internal rotation of the hip to go up. Okay? Now again, I'm not saying there's not other stuff happening in the hip, but we analyze joint by joint, and we analyze plane by plane when there's a lot of stuff happening at that point. So the hip, triaxial, 6 motions and different variations, a lot of stuff happening. So to not be confused, we separate, even though we're doing the hip joint by itself, we have to splice it even more. What was there sagittal stuff? Was there frontal stuff? Was there transverse stuff? And sometimes the stuff happens in combinations. That's okay. I can travel northeast, but I know that me going north technically has nothing to do with me going east. Those are two separate things that are happening at the same time. I'll get to you 1 second. If I take my hip and I go ab, flex, what is that? That's northeast. It's a combination of abduction and flexion just happening at the same time. So how would we communicate that motion? Well, the sagittal component was flexion and the frontal component was abduction. There's no new motion for it. Yes? It's just like combining colors. Orange and blue make green, but technically that green is made up of orange and blue. So it might look like green, but it's really just a combination of the two other colors. Yes, ma'am. Sorry for that delay.
We were talking about the transverse rotation and then I thought you were talking about the pelvis. So when I was doing that squat, there was no transverse. Or was there?
No.
No, okay. That's why it said
No, it's because, and that goes to our last lesson, where I can have transverse rotation of my hip joint, and it doesn't have to line up with transverse rotation of my pelvic girdle. So in other words, this hip rotation, internal and external, is technically in my pelvis's frontal plane, but it's in my hip's transverse plane because rotation of the hip is owned by the femur's perspective. So as the femur flexes, its transverse plane changes because it's a local reference. It would be as if you were the femur. Used magic, you're the femur, you're looking forward, and here you'd be laying on your back.
Right.
You'd be laying on your back looking at the ceiling, so when you do this, you're actually just rolling on the ground. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Transverse hip, but not lined up with transverse pelvis. And this helps to explain why lateral pelvic girdle rotation was messing with hip rotation on my left. Because those two things don't have to be lined up. Because remember, when I'm doing lateral pelvic girdle rotation, it's not just about what's on the left side. The right side is also moving too. So I can't take away this side's perspective and plop it into a new place. That right side of the pelvis is like, dude, that doesn't matter to me. I'm doing a cartwheel to my right, cartwheel to my left. It's almost like, think of it like this. It's almost as if the left socket, its priority is to its fused part in terms of its plane of sight. The hip is independent, or the femur is independent of what's on the right side, but not the socket. The socket has to move with the other side. Is that better? Okay. Let's take a look at this guy. Because he does it on his left, so maybe there's like a different view. And one. Let's see if I can stop it a little bit sooner. I think that's a good stoppage. So you can see how his right hip is adducted relative to anatomical. Think of it like this. He no longer has anything to block it. So let's see, it's in the back of him. Now he can adduct from anatomical. He can go further. Okay? But it's the left hip that I want us to look at. Take your head and go left ear, left shoulder, and try to visualize his pelvis pouring water out the right side. You see it? Like if he had a belt on, the belt would be angled. For this side of the class. I mean, heck, you can see that his lower shirt kind of represents what the pelvis is going on there. You see that? So if his pelvis is right laterally tilted, I could say, all right, his pelvis is here. What would his hip have to do to be in that similar position? I'd have to have external rotation. It'd have to be externally rotated to be here. So his left hip is externally rotated. And again, some of you may say, but wouldn't he also be flexed? Yeah, that's okay. We're not having a flexion extension conversation right now. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think it's obvious that the easier one to see is the flexion or the extension, right? Now let's work on the harder one to see so that you get it right on your test. Okay? So going down, I'm not gonna pause it, we'll watch the whole thing. So going down, he's gonna have external rotation of his hip, and then coming up, he's gonna have internal rotation of his hip. external, internal. And then he kicked up a little abduction for good measure. I'm going to pause it. We'll do pelvic girdle rotation next. Wham! Oh. Let's see if I can be quicker. Wham. Yay! All right. Tell me about left hip position and pelvic girdle rotation when he went up to that position. That's his final, he's on vacation, and that's the final destination for this question. How did his pelvis rotate to get there, and what rotated it? What motion at the hip moved so that his pelvis could have that type of rotation? Give it some thought, discuss with your neighbor, because this is where learning happens. Again, don't worry about the right. The right can do anything it wants. Nothing's going to affect that pelvis until the left hip moves. Does that make sense? That right leg is off the ground. It's on roller skates. That right leg could come off. Like if this was a G.I. Joe figure, you pop it off and you still have the same position and the same movement. Yes. Pelvic girdle rotation and the motion that was responsible for to go up to there. I'll try to give you some hints. Okay, let's try something silly because it's Friday, right? If the answer is yes, clap or cheer. And if the answer is no, boo. Okay? Is the pelvis here? It's kind of fun. Is the pelvis here? Is the pelvis here? Is it here? Hey! That was neat. I need to remember that. So just to try to help you see hip position from where the pelvis is at. Okay? How would the pelvis go from here to cheer? Left lateral pelvic girdle rotation. And if the pelvis rotates because of the body, something had to spin it. Something had to move it. Okay? Left hip, abduction. So think of it like this. The left hip abducting made the pelvis do this. And you're like, how does that happen? Well, you have muscles that pull in the direction of abduction, and those muscles can anchor high and make the lower part go out, or they can anchor low and make the higher part go down. And you know this is true because if you try to stand on one leg for a long time, you're going to feel the burn right here. Because the same muscles that do this can make this do that. Aha. All right. Any questions?
Whenever we said that her right hip was external rotated, correct?
When she went down.
Yes, sir. Would we say that her left hip is, I always assumed, but would be internal?
Well, let's see. Let's see, because you were 1,000% correct. We do not assume. So let's analyze it. Let's go back to her. Like I said, I can tell you the secret, but I was sworn to secrecy from the Tibetan monks that I worked with. Yeah. So I can't tell you. All right, let's check it out. So we're analyzing the hip that's off the ground right now as a practice. So we're going left hip analyzation, right? Not right, left. That's what I hate about rights and lefts. All right, in this position, now keep in mind, some of the motion, none of any movement that she potentially has at her left hip has to do with pelvic girdle rotation, has to do with her coming down, other than clearing an obstacle and helping her balance, trying to maintain her center of balance over her baseboard. You know what that leg is like? That leg is like a high rope walker, tightrope walker, having the pole out. That's what that leg is. Does that make sense? So whatever motion she does or does have is for that reason. Here, her left hip is externally rotated relative to anatomical. But that doesn't mean it had to. In other words, they're not tied together. They're moving for different reasons. But I know she's externally rotated because the front of her thigh, the anterior thigh, the anterior of her thigh is actually pointing this way. The front, I'm looking at the inside of her thigh as we're looking straight ahead. I know that because I see the inside of her knee. Or maybe a better way is, since her patella is facing this way, the front of her thigh is also facing that way. The inside of her thigh is facing forward. So the only way she can get the inside of her thigh to face forward is to externally rotate. Does that make sense? So here's the front. The front is there. So therefore, those are the context clues that I know that she has to be. So technically, in this position, she would have bilateral hip external rotation. She would have her legs crossed, like if she was sitting crisscross, apple cross. But those motions are circumstantial. It's not like they had. It's not like if she had both feet on the ground and she anterior, she would have had to have had bilateral hip flexion. Thank you for your question. We're good? Any other questions before we move on? Was this a cool practice?
Can you post those on the Instagram?
Do the what?
Can you post the pictures of those on the Instagram?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Crazy.
I think we should do it.
So jealous. Oh, you want to?
Yeah.
I'd have to get you guys to sign a waiver, probably.
Really?
I know, I'm joking.
Oh.
I'd have to sign a waiver. That got made it way too easy. All right. Let's get back to. Okay. So, the lesson of today with pelvic girdle rotations is pouring water out the right side. First of all, how many of you, and you don't have to answer this, but some people see it better with the water pour. But some people are like, I don't really get the water pour. I like the basketball roll. Like if the basketball were to roll this way, it would roll to my right, to my left. It would roll forward, roll back. So when I say pour water out, if that doesn't work for you, feel free to say, how would the basketball roll? Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. So, what I want to show you is right lateral pelvic girdle rotation can be left side getting hiked up, water poured out the right, or right side being hiked down. You get to the same place. Examples of that. Right hip abduction would hike the left side up to give me right lateral. But left hip adduction would hike the right side down and give me the same spin of the pelvis. For the pelvic girdle, this is the same rotation as this. Different joint motions, that's okay. The spin is the same. Good? Okay? This is the same pelvic girdle rotation as this. Okay? Let's do the other side. This would be the same pelvic girdle rotation as this. Left lateral because of left hip ab. Also left lateral because of right hip add. Cool? Okay. The trunk, I'm not going to lecture about the trunk. However, just like last in Unit 1, I introduced you to some concepts so that it wasn't brand new when we get to Unit 3. If we were to stand and rotate the pelvis, first of all, is the pumpkin kind of working? Does that work to see? Good. Y'all are going to come to your second exam? The trick or treat act. This is what I'm about to do. Just I won't have the pumpkin. I'm about to do this, and I'm about to do this, and both feet are going to be on the ground. Okay? If I were to stand and have right lateral and left lateral, I need to see what's happening in my hips, because my hips are is what's rotating the pelvis. Okay? So step number 1, right lateral because of left hip add. Whoa, we just established that left hip add can do the right lateral. And because of right hip ab. Wow, we just established that right hip ab can do the right lateral. So what happens is when we do both of them at the same time, you can, it's like when two people are playing with the kiddos on the merry-go-round for recess. You can spin the merry-go-round more efficiently if you have someone on each side of the merry-go-round pushing in two different straight lines, but in the same spin. And that's what's happening here. You have different linear pulls, but they're creating the same torque, the same spin. We call that a force couple in physics and biomechanics. This is more efficient than just one or the other. This is more efficient than just one or the other. Does that make sense? So that's what's happening here. You get kind of this force couple. You get two people on each side of the merry-go-round that can help to spin. Okay? That's the first part. First part. Right lateral, left hip add, right hip add. Right lateral, left hip add, right hip add. Right lateral. Now what we know in the real world is your trunk isn't going to be like, isn't going to like go along for the ride. And that's what today's kind of second part of this class is about. You do this lateral stuff all the time when you shift weight. You're weight bearing on your left. You're standing in line, probably on campus, waiting for something. And you're like, you're standing on your left leg, and then all of a sudden you shift your weight to your right. Guys, that's pelvic girdle rotation and hip ab and adduction when that happens. But you know what doesn't happen is this. Shift weight on my right, and I'm the leaning tower of Cambiza. I'm not leaning here. My trunk doesn't stay straight. My trunk seems to stay straight. It's not straight. And then you lean, you shift your weight to the other side. It seems that your trunk stayed straight, but it didn't stay straight. So what I need to introduce you to is this concept of if my trunk stayed straight and I did right lateral as my pelvis, the silly props that I use. If my spine stayed straight, we'll go along for the ride. So if I'm trying to keep my shoulders level, it would make sense that my trunk would want to kind of bend back the other way. And if my trunk stayed bent and I shifted weight and I didn't move my trunk, I'd be over here. So I need to bend back the other way. So again, it's subtle and it's coming, but I needed you to see that something as subtle as this makes your trunk move. Because it has to. Because if it didn't, you'd be doing this. Bend. Bend. You got it like this. Pelvis, trunk. If I do this, and I don't want to tilt over to the side, I'd have to bend back the other way. And if I do this, I need to bend back the other way. Okay? So that's common. Let's do some practice. There's an illustration of what I was just talking about. You got the basketball, you can spin it, you got the stuff under it, like the hands, and you got the stuff on top of it, like the palm in it. All right, let's do some practice. Let's do a little pop quiz. This I can count for it, it's just practice. Start. I'm going to be on my left leg. Start. Finish. Start. Finish. Here's the question. Pelvic girdle rotation. Yes or no? Did it or didn't? If the answer is no, then you're done. But if the answer is yes, then you have to follow up with how. How did the pelvis rotate? And then a second follow-up is what rotated? What motion was responsible for the pelvic girdle rotation? Does that make sense? Okay, I'll do it a couple more times. Start, finish. I'm getting old, but this support is to make sure I don't move anything else. I'm trying to really isolate what I'm asking you guys. And I'm old. Start, finish. Did the pelvic girdle rotate? If the answer is no, you're done. If the answer is yes, how? And then why? I guess would be a great question. Why did it rotate? What rotated? Okay. Did it rotate? Yes or no? Yes. How? Posteriorly. Good. Very good. How? Just curious. Who sees it because of the water pour analogy that I teach you? Who sees it because of the basketball spin or the ball spin? Good. That's how I see it too. That doesn't mean poor people. Oh, gosh, that sounded like poor people. I'm in that number, man. I'm telling you. That doesn't mean pour out people have to change their way of looking at it at all. I actually developed the concept of the pour well after I developed the concept of the basketball. So I think I was kind of married to the basketball concept and then came up with other examples. And not to toot, because obviously like I dress like I'm homeless, but nowhere else in the country or the world are people teaching this stuff, especially like this. Okay? So wear that with a badge of honor, man. When you go out to grad school, I'm telling you, you're going to be teaching your peers how this stuff works. Because they're going to be like, this makes no sense. And you'll be like, it's like a bucket. It's like a trick-or-treat bucket. Okay. Posterior. Now again, it's that follow-up question. That posterior pelvic girdle rotation can't happen on its own. Something had to do it. Something had to be responsible for it. Was it my right hip? Did my right hip going forward make my pelvis go back? Not at all. In fact, my right hip could keep going if it wanted to. My right hip could do the hokey pokey if it wanted to. My pelvis is like, I'm stuck here until the other thing makes me come back. So it was the left hip. The left hip extension was responsible for the posterior pelvic girdle. Some of you, rightfully so, maybe like Campbell, what is this ever going to be used for? A few things. Being able to see things that are happening that may not be obvious can be very helpful in etiology of injuries, helping people. But let's think about just simple stretches. If I'm trying to stretch my hip flexion pulling muscles, I'd want to posteriorly pelvic girdle rotate because of my right hip extension, and Lord, do I feel that stretching. It's the same concept. And my left hip, yeah, I had some left hip extension, but I was already flexed, so the extension kind of kept me in a flexed position, so I'm not feeling anything here. But because I started out with my right hip already extended, the posterior pelvic girdle rotation is going to make me extend even more. I'm going to feel that stretch in the front. You got to be able to see that. Someone may be cheating and like, I don't feel it. And then that's when you're going to come in, isolate that hip, make sure they pelvic girdle rotate, and then they're going to be like, oh, I feel it now. Because you were able to see what they want. And that's okay. That's why you're going to get paid to do what you do for a living. Okay? We're good? All right, y'all have a good weekend. I hope this was fun.
Yes, that's like all my